Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to today's the Hindu Newspaper Analysis, where we shall be analyzing the articles which have appeared in the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper for today. So let us take a look at the topics that we are going to hold the discussion for. So today overall we are going to discuss 6 different topics, few of them relevant for your mains as well as prelims and few of them relevant only for your prelims perspective. So the first topic that we are going to discuss is India needs a uniform civil code, which has appeared in the editorial page, and that is going to be relevant for your GS paper 2. Now this is an article which has been written by the former Vice President of the country, Venkaiah Naidu. So that is why we are going to just look at the gist of the article, that what is his opinion about the Uniform Civil Code, and in the meanwhile we shall also be looking at the basics of it. We are going to separate ourselves from the noise around it and we are just going to analyze that what is Uniform Civil Code and what can be the benefits and the concerns which are associated. Then internationalizing the rupee without the coin tossing. Now this is again an article which continues the trend of internationalization of rupee as a currency, which has been appearing in the newspapers for the past few weeks. So this is again another article in that respect. This will be relevant for your GS paper 3, particularly in the economy section, and this is an important topic for that matter. Then what are the provisions of the High Seas Treaty? So the High Seas Treaty has been recently concluded. So what is it? And there are certain concerns for the developed nations, and the developed nations, they have raised these issues and they have basically expressed their reservation to be a part of this treaty. So that is something that we are going to analyze. Then for the prelims perspective, we are going to take a look into understanding dark patterns. What do we mean by dark patterns and how is it that consumer awareness can play a role in getting rid of these dark patterns. Then Chandrayaan 3 launch on July 14. So that is the expected date for Chandrayaan 3 launch. So it will have a rover mechanism. That is something that we are going to take a look into. Then Finance Minister pushes for reforms to spur FDI. So this has appeared in the business section. So that again is something that we are going to take a look into. Now without further ado, let us take a look into the first topic of the day. And the first topic is India needs a uniform civil code. This has appeared in the editorial section and this is going to be relevant for your GS2. Now here, for the past week and a half, you would have heard a lot of discussion about Uniform Civil Code, and I'm sure most of you by this point of time would know the basics of it. Now, in this particular article, the former Vice President of the country, Mr. Venkaiah Naidu, has expressed his own opinion about what this Uniform Civil Code is and how this debate has been raging on ever since the time of the Constituent Assembly, and the framers of the Indian Constitution also had quite a vociferous debate about what is the requirement, the need, or whether we don't need this Uniform Civil Code. Now here, before getting into the nitty-gritties about the advantage, the disadvantage, the concerns which are associated, what is it that the Supreme Court holds as an opinion, first of all, let us attack the very basics of it. Now, the basic Uniform Civil Code. What is the meaning of it? First of all, if we separate the civil portion from here, it basically means uniform code, means a kind of a uniform law which applies to everyone. Now here civil, what does that refer to? So in matters of civil issues, for example, in the cases of marriage, divorce, and succession, in these issues and in these areas, till now, the prevalent condition is that you have personal laws based upon the religious tenets and the religious beliefs which are still being followed in various different parts of the country. After all, the diversity is quite immense. Now, what this Uniform Civil Code actually aims to do is to find a kind of a uniform platform and a kind of a same platform and the same law to be applied to all the citizens of the country in the matters of marriage, divorce, and succession. Now here, if we take a look at it, the basic definition, if someone asks you, what do we mean by Uniform Civil Code? Oftentimes we hear so much about it from the various media channels, the news headlines, etc., that in the din and in the noise, we forget the very basics. So it is the code or the kind of law procedure which aims to enforce a uniform legal framework to all the citizens, irrespective of their religion. So what that means is that the personal laws which have been driving the cases of marriage, divorce conditions, as well as the conditions of succession in many different areas, now that will be curtailed, and eventually you will have one law applicable for all. Now, at the time of the framing of the Indian Constitution, there was a significant amount of debate which was conducted on the floor of the Constituent Assembly, with various different members voicing their opinions for and against the application and implementation of Uniform Civil Code. Now, you had few people such as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, K.M. Munshi, etc., who had expressed their opinion that why, for a large country, the application of Uniform Civil Code, particularly in terms of marriage, succession and divorce, is very, very essential. But then you also had other people voicing their opinion that how the religious beliefs can be hampered because of the following of these laws and these codes. Now, as a result of that, this Uniform Civil Code and the aspect associated with that was included in Part 4 of the Constitution. And Part 4 of the Constitution basically is what? Part 4 is the DPSP, or the Directive Principle of State Policy. And this Uniform Civil Code was enshrined in that, which meant what? Which basically meant that the state over a period of time should work towards including this. That was the purpose. That is why you will find that the provisions regarding the Uniform Civil Code have been enshrined in Article 44 of the Indian Constitution, and what it states, if you take a look at it verbatim, basically it means that the state shall endeavor, it shall try, it shall make an effort to secure for the citizens a uniform civil code throughout the territory of India. So applicable for all the citizens. Now here, what is the noise which is created around this Uniform Civil Code? You have such a polarized debate going on that you have sections of population who do have a belief that this is the thing which needs to be done, and you also have simultaneously large sections of population who are very antithetical to it and who believe that this can mean a danger and damage to their religious beliefs. Now, let us understand in very brief that what it means. So basically, when we talk about personal laws, now personal laws, particularly for the case of, let's say, marriage, okay, marriage. Now in that case, the aspects for marriage in various different religious communities is very different. For example, the age or the minimum age required for the woman to get or the girls to get married, that is again listed or cited to be different in different religions. So as a result of that, many of the times that can lead to a certain set of exploitation. Anyways, when we talk about the various different religious laws and the religious beliefs, regardless of the religion concerned, you will find that generally there is a patriarchal association associated with that, which means that in almost all the various different religious tenets and the personal laws, it is the women who get the poorer share of the pie, and it is largely male dominated. And that can be said uniformly across. So in these cases, oftentimes when the personal law drives the factor and drives the conversation and also the legal aspect of it, the women and the girls, they are left short-handed. And again, another factor, for example, if you consider succession. Now, succession, that is from one generation to another, let's suppose how the property will get distributed, who will get a greater right for that property, etc. Now here again, the personal laws oftentimes are male-oriented or male-biased. As a result of that, oftentimes the women folk, they are on the verge or on the hand of getting slightly exploited. So as a result of that, again, leads to or is antithetical to women empowerment. After all, we all are aware that women empowerment is very, very important if you want to carry out a long-term progress of the society in any area. So these two particularly, and along with that, the divorces and the divorce conditions as well, they also are different. So that is why even the Supreme Court has basically mentioned in certain judgments that the state should endeavor to bring about a uniform civil code. And the famous citation of the Supreme Court, which is oftentimes cited across various media channels, newspaper headlines, etc. Now, Supreme Court in the very famous Shah Bano case. Now, Shah Bano case was famous because of multiple reasons. So, you had the Shah Bano case of 1985. Now, in that Shah Bano case of 1985, it was a case of marital dispute, and thereby the Supreme Court basically ordered the husband and their family, the ex-husband and their family, to pay alimony to the wife. Now, that created a lot of ruckus and that created a lot of debate around it. The government also brought about certain measures to countervene the Supreme Court judgment. Now, at that point of time, Supreme Court had basically issued a statement that, look, ideally for these issues, you should have a common platform and a common code which should apply to everyone so that everyone can be treated at the same manner. Nobody is subjected to an exploitative method just because the personal laws are not very clear enough. And that is again another problem, because in many of the cases, it is not about whether the personal laws are good or bad. It is that in many of the cases, the personal laws, they are open to interpretation. And that is where whenever anything is open to interpretation, there is a lot of arbitrary nature which follows the various judgments, the rulings, etc. And as a result of that, it can lead to again, some sort of patriarchal character building up in the society in the long run. Now, there again, Supreme Court had again, based upon the notice and based upon the petitions, that look, you are talking about implementation of the Uniform Civil Code, but what will happen for the religious beliefs? We have the absolute right to believe or to follow our own religious practices and beliefs. And that is where the Supreme Court had also opined that, look, when it comes to the matter of following your own religious beliefs and your own religious tenets and practices, that has been well ensured and enshrined in the fundamental rights of the Constitution, or Part 3 of the Indian Constitution, that guarantees or ensures the rights to the citizens to be able to follow their own religious practices and beliefs, and that should be prevalent and that is sacrosanct. So, Supreme Court said that, look, both of them, they don't oppose each other. It is not as if following your religious beliefs does not mean that Uniform Civil Code should not be applied. Both of them can act independently as well. But then there are certain concerns which are raised as well. Now, what are the concerns? The concerns raised are that if without proper consultation, if let's suppose this Uniform Civil Code is pushed through, and this Uniform Civil Code, if it is pushed through, let's say it is passed, then that can lead to significant amount of disgruntlement and disenchantment across various sections of the society. Now, it is not a matter of avoiding those disgruntlement and disenchantments and carrying on with your daily activities. The entire nation needs to be brought together, and there needs to be a consultative process, and that consultative process needs to be carried on, and a final amicable solution should be arrived at. That is what the ex-vice president is also talking about. That is what his opinion has expressed and been expressed in this article. So overall, that is what you need to know as per the requirement of this article. So in this article, what is it that we have looked into? What is that Uniform Civil Code? We have looked into that what is the Supreme Court's understanding of the Uniform Civil Code. We have looked into why is it, or what is the nature, or what are the compulsions due to which Uniform Civil Code needs to be applied in terms of the conditions of women and women empowerment, and basically rooting out patriarchy from the society in many aspects. But then again, the concerns are quite prevalent. Now here, the question, another aspect which you should be aware of, that is that Uniform Civil Code applicable in any part of India as of now? So the answer of it is, other than Goa, no other state has got a Uniform Civil Code. Now, Goa is the only state in India, and this is a trivia that you should be aware of. Goa is the only state in India which follows a Uniform Civil Code, and Goa follows the Portuguese Civil Code. Portuguese Civil Code of 1867. So that means for civil matters in Goa, every citizen or every individual will be treated as per the Portuguese Civil Code. Now, this Portuguese Civil Code was enforced eventually after the passing of the Goa Daman and Diu Administration Act of 1962. Once that act was passed, then Goa was allowed to implement this civil code. So which act allowed Goa to implement this? That was the Goa Daman and Diu Administration Act of 1962. Okay, that allowed Goa to pass and enforce this Portuguese Civil Code 1867. Now here, before ending this topic, let me tell you that as a serious candidate of civil services, please try to refrain from taking vehemently only one particular side of the argument. That is the compulsion, or that is the innate human characteristic where oftentimes we have a set of bias against a particular set of beliefs or a set of ideals. Always, as a civil services candidate, you should have the ability to reflect on both sides of the argument. So while you are talking about the benefits to the women, you also have to simultaneously talk about the disenchantment across the society, which is never a good sign, which is never a good or a healthy aspect of the society moving ahead. So while you are writing an answer, even though UPSC generally does not ask such controversial topics or topics which have been in controversy, such topics are avoided even by UPSC. But then if the question is asked by a UPSC in the mains or in the interview process, make sure that you represent both sides of the argument and what are the concerns and what should be the way forward. So what is the way forward? A broader consultative process, because you have many different minorities and many different groupings, ethnic groupings, religious groupings across the country. And the personal laws for all of them are quite different. So that is why all of them need to be taken into confidence, and only after that a future measure should be taken into consideration. That should be your ideal way forward. While you are writing a conclusion, this will also impart the idea that you have a solution finding attitude, and that will be rewarded in the exam as well. Now, moving on to the second article, Internationalizing the Rupee Without the Coin Tossing. Now, this is an article again dealing with the internationalization of the rupee as a global currency. Okay, now here when we talk about it, when we talk about internationalizing the rupee, you have to understand that the government for some time has been working significantly to make rupee an international currency or an international currency of exchange, so that once rupee is traded on the international platform and used as a trading mechanism, the benefits are quite significant. Something that we had discussed even yesterday, that when we talk about internationalizing, the benefits are straightforward. And first of all, internationalizing means what? A global currency. Global currency of exchange. Now, first of all, before getting into the advantages, let us analyze whether it is something which has been initiated now or whether this is something which had been prevalent earlier as well. So, for a long period of time, that is up till around 60s, Indian rupee was an accepted denomination, accepted legal tender in the Gulf countries as well. Even in countries such as Nepal and Bhutan, till very recently, rupee was accepted as a legal tender. But then, over a period of time, due to our various different monetary policies, the economic crises that we faced, the devaluation of the rupee which happened multiple times. Now, due to that, the various different countries and economies, they lost their confidence in the currency. Because please understand, a global currency is as good as the confidence of the various different members who are trading in them. For example, let's suppose you and I, we are exchanging certain goods and I am paying you certain currency. Now, if that currency is make-believe, then you will not have any confidence in that currency and that currency's value will go down. Something which is being observed in the case of cryptocurrencies as of now. So that is why that global confidence, if that is not present, then nobody will be able to or ready to accept that as a uniform or a kind of an accepted currency mechanism. So this was prevalent earlier. But then recently the government has revitalized its push to again make it an international currency of exchange. And it has taken certain steps in the process. First of all, it has allowed external commercial borrowings in rupee denomination. What are external commercial borrowings? So when the organizations, the companies, the institutes, when they require certain amount of money, when they are required to borrow some amount of money, they can go to the international markets and there they can borrow. Now that can be done in rupee denomination. Anyways, once you carry this out, you make rupee much more acceptable across global platforms. Then after that, there has been a push by the government and by the RBI for the Indian banks to open up rupee vostro account for banks from Russia, Mauritius, UAE and Sri Lanka. Now rupee vostro account, what is the meaning of this? So basically, this is a kind of a special account maintained where the actual denominations are maintained in the other currency. So for example, a bank from Russia, let's suppose a bank from Russia B, let's suppose they open up an account, and in that account the money that they will hold will be in rupee denomination rather than the dollar denomination. As of now, the most commonly accepted hard currency is what? Dollar. So when we talk about vostro account, that is where the domestic banks, they allow the international banks to open up their account, provided that the international banks, they maintain the currency in the local currency. So that is where again the predominance of rupee will increase, and there is a larger purpose behind it as well, which we need to understand. That if these banks and the banks coming from these particular countries, if they are able to make or maintain the rupee denomination, then for trading activities with these countries, for FDI inflows from these countries, these banks will oftentimes be very much enticed to use rupee. Right? So rupee trade will become much more prominent. So as a direct consequence of that, rupee trade becomes more predominant. And more common, and anything which is more common becomes more acceptable in the process also. Now India has also arrived at currency swap agreements. Currency swap agreements with countries such as Sri Lanka. Now what is that currency swap agreement? Whereby the domestic currencies can be held in each other's reserve banks and the reserve currencies as well. So again, if for any country, let's say you have a currency swap, so if that country is buying a good for you, from you, or selling a good, they can pay and exchange rupee in the process. So these are few of the steps. But still, it is a practical reality that internationalization of rupee is very far away from reality. And there are certain issues which are keeping it far away from reality. So what are the issues? The issues are, first of all, lack of confidence in the rupee. In the case of dollar denomination, there is a lot of confidence of the international market, the traders and the international community that dollar is there to stay. But then in the case of rupee, that confidence is sometimes wavering. And in this article, it has been pointed out that various events such as the recent discontinuation of the 2000 rupee denomination notes and also the earlier decision of demonetization of notes further reduced the confidence in rupee in the countries such as Nepal and Bhutan. So if the confidence decreases in a currency, various different countries, they will be forced and rather encouraged to use other mechanisms for exchange. Then it is a known fact that even today, rupee share in international trade is very low. It is roughly around 1.4%. And with that little amount of presence of rupee in international trade, you cannot expect the international community to readily accept rupee just because we are very good people. That can never be a side of the argument. So if rupee starts, or if Indian trade starts dominating, and in that, if let's say rupee trade also starts dominating, in that case, people will get more rupee, buy more rupee, the demand will increase. Then you have a lack of complete convertibility. What do we mean by convertibility? So convertibility is of two types. You have current account convertibility, capital account convertibility. So when we talk about convertibility, it is the ability to invest in fixed assets, capital investment in various different countries, and a free flow of investment in the local currency in and out. So for example, let's suppose an investor from Singapore can have the assets and investment in assets in a free flow manner without much of a regulatory mechanism and can take out the money easily as well. That is referred to as full convertibility. Now, India does not allow full convertibility. There were various different commissions. For example, you had the Tarapur committee, which actually did signify and which did emit that signal to the government that look, you can go for the partial convertibility. But then, ever since the 1997 and the late 90s economic crisis of Southeast Asia, where the Southeast Asian nations and rather the countries around Singapore, etc., Korea, etc., now they had allowed full convertibility. Now, during the time of economic crisis, what happens is that everybody, if they are allowed a free flow investment and a free flow outtake in the time of the economic crisis, the foreign investors will take their money out immediately from all the fixed assets as well, and they will convert it into dollar terms and they will pump money out of your system, and that can lead to economic crisis. So that late 90s economic crisis which struck these countries is still a stark reminder in terms of Indian policymakers, and Indian policymakers are still reluctant to allow that. And the argument is that the only reason that India was isolated from that economic crisis was because India did not have complete convertibility. That is also an argument which is put forward, that how and why during the 2008 economic meltdown, global economic meltdown which happened, and the financial crisis of 2008 which happened, India was again isolated from it, and India was not impacted quite significantly because India did not allow complete capital convertibility. So there is a kind of a hesitation to allow that complete capital and current account convertibility, and that is why majority of the international traders, they are still reluctant to buy that rupee, because they always have the fear that what will we do with all that rupee denomination that we have. The case in point is that the Russian oil that we are trading, and it has been reported in the news headline multiple times now, that Russia is sitting atop huge piles of rupee denomination worth billions. But then the Russian traders, they are not aware about what to do with that and how to deal with that rupee, because that rupee cannot be easily converted anywhere. That rupee cannot be invested easily anywhere. They need to convert that into dollar or in other currency before carrying out their economic process. So as a result of that economic disadvantage, there is a reluctance for accepting rupee. And that is where the lack of awareness amongst traders, that is again a prime factor. So these are various different issues which are plaguing the internationalization. But it is here, as the article points out, that we can take a leaf out of China's book. Now, China, over a period of time, has started making the renminbi much more acceptable across the world. And that was not the case 20 years back. late 1990s and early 2000s, renminbi was not a currency which was acceptable across. But then China carried this process in a phased manner, where first of all, what China did was that it allowed certain amount of convertibility. Convertibility was allowed. Initially in the current market, that is daily exchanges, investments, etc., small investments, etc. That was allowed in certain extent. So that popularized some amount of renminbi. Then after that, China arrived at more currency swap agreements. Currency swap agreements. With whom? With countries such as Brazil, UK, etc. Major trading partners of China. So China indulged and finalized the currency swap agreement so that they also hold some amount of renminbi reserves. And please understand, by this point of time in the early 2000s, basically the entire world was witnessing the rise of the global economic giant that was China. So everybody was very much sold with the China story. So for them, it was anyways incentivizing, and they thought of it as investing in the future of economy. And that is why they readily agreed to that currency swap agreement. What does that tell you? That the strength of the economy is very important in making a currency much more acceptable. Then after that, what it did was that it allowed the people having, or the various institutions and various different reserve banks having excess amount of renminbi reserves, now that was allowed to be invested in debt securities. Now debt securities are considered to be secure form of investment. So again, making renminbi much more acceptable. So any country having excessive amount of renminbi, in India's case right now, Russia is having excessive amount of rupee and Russia doesn't know what to do with it. So in such situations, what China did allow was that if you have excessive amount of renminbi, come and invest in the debt securities. So that increased the level of investment as well. And at the same time, it bolstered the utility of renminbi across various platforms. So that made it much more common. Now, here, that gives us an idea about what we should do going ahead. So moving ahead, the first basic fundamental that we have to ensure is strengthening of economy. Strengthening of economy. Now, what does that mean, strengthening of economy? Oftentimes we hear the news that now we have become the 5th largest economy. Now the news headlines go on that we are set to become the 3rd largest economy. These news continue to prevail. So how will we make our economy stronger? So strengthening of economy is done by controlling the deficits. Which deficits? So the fiscal deficit, first of all, fiscal deficit, revenue deficit, which is very important, and also eventually primary deficit. Primary deficit basically gives you an idea about the amount of borrowing that you have, right? So primary deficit. These are the 3 major types of deficits. So if you control these deficits, and this was also pointed out by the earlier appointed Tarapur committee, and Tarapur committee had said that, look, first of all, control your deficits. After you have controlled your deficits, your economy will become strong enough to withstand any kind of shock from sudden pull out of money or sudden pull out of large scale investments and converting them in various different currencies. So the economy will become resilient, and the only way to make economy resilient is to eliminate. It is not possible to eliminate all these deficits, but to control them in the best possible manner and keep it below the threshold limit. So that is something that India has yet to achieve. Then other than that, if we do that, the economy will get strengthened, and that will increase the confidence. Increases the confidence. Now, here, Other than that, what can be done? So, with more countries, we need to arrive at currency swap, particularly larger trading partners. So, currency swap, right? Phased allowance of capital account convertibility. Okay. Now phased allowance, so it cannot be the case that suddenly today everything has been made completely convertible. It is something which will be a phased process. It can take around 10 to 20 years to allow the complete capital account convertibility. So that phasing process needs to begin. And then another thing needs to be done is you can provide certain amount of tax incentives. For example, let's suppose an investor investing in rupee denomination or actually trading in rupee denomination, they should be provided certain incentives. So that incentive program will always give them economic benefits. Please understand, anybody, if they will accept rupee as a denomination, is not going to be because they like India as a country, they like that how the people are, they like the food that we consume, and we are good-natured people, that is why they will start trading in rupee. No, that is never going to happen. Unless and until they have the economic incentive to do so, nobody will invest that. So that is where economic incentivization needs to be provided. In the form of tax breaks, reliefs, investment priorities, etc. can be provided. Okay, so that is what we have discussed in this article. So in this article overall, what have we discussed? That what is that internationalization of rupee, what are the issues faced, what is it that the government is doing for the process, what are the impediments, and where we can learn from the case of our neighbor, that is China, how China has ensured that renminbi becomes much more globally accepted currency. And there again, strength of the economy, ability of China to give out loans and allowing those countries to pay back in renminbi itself. So strength of economy is very, very important. And China, holding trillions of dollars of reserves in foreign exchange, has got the capacity to do so. So we need to strive for that first of all, and then we need to ensure more currency swap. The debts that we are giving or the credit line that we are facilitating for the various countries, we need to ensure that they are incentivized to pay us back in rupee. When they are incentivized to pay us back in rupee, they will hold rupee reserves in their banks as well. More Vostro accounts can be opened, and that is how in the slow process, in the long run, maybe a decade and a half from today, that rupee will become much more predominant. But that can never happen unless and until the rupee share in international trade increases quite drastically. As of now, it is very little, at a paltry sum of around only 1.4% of the international trade. Majority of the international trade is dealt in dollars. So that is why we need to up that level. Okay. Now, after this, we move on to the next topic, and that is, what are the provisions of the High Seas Treaty? So this High Seas Treaty has been arrived at recently, that is on June 19th, that is when UN adopted the marine biodiversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. Now that treaty has been finally adopted after a lot of discussions and deliberations. This entire process was kick-started way back early in 2002. That is when people got an idea or an inkling that we need to arrive at an international treaty to protect the high seas. Now here, when we talk about high seas, what do we mean by that? We'll come to it very briefly. But before that, So various different countries, basically they talked about the requirement for protection of the high seas. Because when it comes to the territorial waters, the various different countries and their own territorial laws, they prevail there. So what the various countries do is, they keep on polluting the high seas, the international waters. They carry out a kind of an unsustainable, let's say, waste dumping and other activities in those areas, which is never conducive, and environmental degradation is happening quite significantly. So that is when in 2002 it was a decision which was taken that we need to preserve them. Then following that, by 2008 there was a much clearer understanding about the need to implement a global standard or treaty, and that would be done with the help of intergovernmental conferences, or IGC. That is intergovernmental conferences. Now these were basically platforms for deliberation, discussions which could be carried out, that how we should arrive at the protection of the high seas and conservation and preservation of the high seas. Because please understand, around 50% of the overall oceanic area is in international waters when it comes to the high seas, and they are managed by the international jurisdiction and the international law. The UN clause is the driving factor behind them, and there are significant amount of biodiversity, natural resources which are present in that region, which are on a threat of existence itself. So that is where 5 different IGCs and conferences have been held, and after those long drawn conferences, finally the treaty has been arrived at. Now first of all, let us understand what do we mean by the high seas. So here, UN clause, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which was arrived at in 1982, what it does is, it divides the water bodies into 5 different areas or 5 different zones. The inland waters in the territory of a region, territorial waters which extend 12 nautical miles from the coastline. Then you have the contiguous zone further extending 12 nautical miles, the exclusive economic zone which extends 200 nautical miles from the coastline of a country, where the country has got exclusive economic right for exploitation in those areas. And then beyond that EEZ, or the exclusive economic zone, beyond that it is referred to as the high seas. Okay, it is considered beyond the exclusive economic zone, beyond the EEZ. Now this high seas needs to be protected and conserved. Here you have lots of various species that we have not yet discovered, and that is where, and recently the news headlines which broke the various different media platforms was basically that even the International Seabed Authority is coming up with new code for mining at the seabed. The deep sea mining codes are being finalized. So deep sea mining will again disturb the high sea environment. So the need for protection is ever more important. So how should that be carried out? For that, you have various measures which have been taken. For example, declaration of a greater number of marine protected areas. So establishment of greater number of marine protected areas, and then fair sharing of benefits from the marine resources. This is a part of the larger Convention on Biological Diversity. When we talk about biological diversity, you have to understand that even the marine organisms, many of the very rare marine organisms found in the high seas, they have certain various different elements and byproducts which can be very beneficial for the pharmaceutical industry. Now, because the international waters are considered as a common resource and a uniform resource for everyone, everybody has got an access or a right to that. So that is where fair sharing of benefits from the marine resources is driven from. Now, for that fair sharing and information sharing of those benefits, the knowledge sharing of the benefits, there is the postulation, or there is a proposal to establish the clearinghouse mechanism, whereby the clearinghouse will ensure the monitoring process as well, whether the information is being shared by the various different nations, and there needs to be transparency. Only if there is transparency can you ensure information sharing as well as monitoring. Okay, these both can never be done without transparency. Then EIA, environmental impact assessment, to be carried out for any project being implemented in the high seas by the scientific and technical body which is postulated to be established, right? So for any, let's say, deep sea mining, you cannot carry out deep sea mining anywhere and everywhere just because you have been registered a particular or allocated a particular space. You need to carry out the EIA. But then in the case of international waters or in the case of high seas, who will carry out that EIA? That is where the scientific and technical body comes into play. Then capacity building and marine technology should be provided to even the island nations, the low income island nations. Because please understand, not everybody has got the required technology to explore the high seas and to basically be aware of the mineral resources available in the high seas. It might be very close to their borders, but they don't have the technology. So that is where technology sharing should also be there. And this is where the developed nations, they got riled up. All the developed nations, majority of them, including United States, including Russia, including China, even after taking part in 5 different intergovernmental conferences, they pulled out of it eventually because they were not ready for that technology sharing. Because they maintain that the technology is very critical and that technology requires specialization. But then the developed nations, they had another issue. And that issue was the fair and equitable access and benefit sharing of marine resources. Now here, various different countries, for example, let's say United States. Now United States has got many different organizations, multinational companies, large conglomerates who are working in order to have a kind of expertise in exploitation of these marine resources, genetic codes, as well as development of pharmaceuticals from those marine biodiversity. Now they are not ready to share that. And if they will share, they charge a very high price. So for that, for those private companies, it is a loss-making deal if everybody is given a share or a fair access to the common good. So that is why the developed countries, they have taken a back seat. And then again, the sharing of technology, sharing of knowledge and technology. Okay, so this is where the developed nations, please keep in mind, not the developing nations. The developing nations, they need the conservation, they are in favor of the conservation, and they are in favor of having an environmental impact assessment carried out and the sharing carried out by the clearinghouse mechanism. They are in favor of that. It is the developed nations who have basically raised issue. Now once they have raised the issue, that means moving ahead. The realization of that treaty and the actual implementation of it is also put in danger. So what is the way forward and the way ahead? So the way forward, first of all, we need to understand, and the international community at the aegis, under the aegis of United Nations, that needs to designate those high seas very carefully and clearly as a common resource and a common good. And thereby, with the help of the licensing system, maybe you can take a particular area and then you carry out that monitoring process or you carry out that extraction process. The monitoring mechanism needs to be strengthened quite significantly. And that is why the scientific and technical body which is to be formed, that needs to be very upright and not influenced by the various compulsions imposed by the developed nations. We have seen already how institutions and organizations such as WHO, they have been impacted by the pressure from countries such as China in the case of the COVID pandemic. So such event, if it happens again, it will serve no good. But eventually, when you're writing an answer for this, always write the conclusion that it is a high time that someone protected the high seas, because it is the high seas where the biodiversity is still not accounted for in detail. So it is for the common good for everyone to come on the same platform and agree on that conservation. Okay? Now, a few questions let me take. Then, Fatima, clearinghouse mechanism, Abhishek, aquatic ecology will be disturbed. Yes, absolutely, Abhishek, it will be disturbed. Fatima, clearinghouse mechanism is basically you will have a clearinghouse which will ensure that whatever, let's suppose from any particular region where there is a small island, let's suppose there are certain amount of genetic resources or genetic information which has been derived from the biodiversity of that region, clearinghouse will clear them to be used across. Now, once the clearinghouse gets the information, that will disperse it to the local community, and that is how you will attain equitable access and sharing. Okay? And Ashu, how it can be important to track official statements to assess the nature and scale of, in this regard, perceived threat from China to India. So it is not something of a greater threat. Please understand, China in itself, as of now, is significantly investing in technology to explore the deep space, deep sea. Till now, no country has got a resilient, economically viable technology to do that. And China and India both are working for that. We also have our own Chandrayaan mission by which we are trying to explore the deep sea. So first of all, we need to be able to explore that deep sea. So once we develop that technology, then we can think about competing with China. As of now, it is not the case. Okay? Now, right. Currency swap agreement, basically, Priya, what it refers to is that various, let's suppose you arrive at a currency swap agreement with Sri Lanka, so both the countries will hold the reserves for each other local currencies, so that in the case of an emergency, fiscal emergency, or in the case of an aid, a grant, or even in the case of a trade, the local currencies can be exchanged. Okay? Now, is there any mechanism that how much resources exploited by the country, Shivam? So that is something basically where, again, we have the mining code which is being developed by the by the International Seabed Authority, which has been in news. So once that code is finalized, you will get an understanding of that. Now we come to certain of the smaller topics. One of them is understanding dark patterns. Now here, for your prelims, what you need to understand is what do you mean by dark patterns. So this particular article largely talks about the consumer and the user experience. And this is something that you would have experienced in your own personal level as well. And what this means is that let's suppose you go and visit a website. Let's suppose you go and visit an e-commerce website. Now on the e-commerce website, many of the times you would have found that you are adding a particular item, some other item gets added automatically, and that is how basically what it does is it is pushing the consumer to buy certain set of items even if the consumer does not want it. Many of the time unwanted pop-up ads come up and it becomes very, very difficult to reject them, and as a result of that the consumer information is forced upon by those websites, and the consumer data is also leaked. So this consumer behavior, that is being altered forcefully and forcibly. So that is where, or that is what has been cited as dark pattern, and this has been cited by Harry Brignall. Okay, the user experience research, he cited the term the dark pattern. So this is prevalent in e-commerce platforms, in online trading platforms, everywhere. And in many of the cases, what even you would have experienced is, let's suppose you don't accept the requirements or the conditionalities of the website, your own experience for that website is downgraded. You are not given the premium services or the services which ideally the consumer is eligible to get. So in many of the cases, it also happens that, let's suppose you buy a certain good, and rather than that particular good, you are given a substandard material. And because the exchange mechanism is so very different and difficult, that is why many of the people are forced to compromise with their choices. So in this way, the various different firms, they are pushing the products. So that is what is referred to as dark pattern. Why it has been in news? That has been in news because recently you had the Indian online marketplaces. They were given a letter from the Department of Consumer Affairs warning them against indulging in these various different practices which borderline on these dark patterns. So that is where for your prelims you should be aware that in terms of consumer affairs, what is dark patterns. Okay, then Chandrayaan 3 to be launched on July 14. This date has been pushed one day ahead, and lunar landing is expected to happen around 1 month from now, that is around August 23 or 24. Now Chandrayaan 3 mission already has been covered in the portion of current affairs, so you would be aware of that it will have a kind of a rover, a lander, and it will also have a propulsion mechanism. So it will orbit the moon and then it will go for soft landing on the moon. Now there it will have the solar panels to be deployed to yield energy or to seek energy from the sun, and it will land only at the time of the sunrise if there is sunrise on the moon. If that sunrise does not happen, the entire module will continue to move around the orbit of the moon and wait another 14 days for the sunrise to happen and then make its landing possible. So here what is it that you should be aware of, that what this Chandrayaan 3 module consists of. Chandrayaan 3 module consists of a lander and a rover. So that lander and a rover, they are expected to perform at a very harsh temperature of around -40 degrees Celsius. So that is why you need to have very robust mechanisms of electronic functioning and emission of communication signals even from that particular condition. So that is something you should be aware of the module details and also the region where the landing is happening. So then moving on to the last topic, and that is where the finance minister and the ministry in itself pushes for reforms to spur the FDI, the foreign direct investment. Because last year, India experienced a decline in the amount of FDI happening. India experienced a decline of close to around 16% in FDI. Now, on the face of it, this 16% might seem very humongous, but you have to understand that the global geopolitical scenario is not conducive for trade anyways. And in the global geopolitical scenario, as of now, across the global economies, the decline in FDI has been by a massive 36%. This is the global decline. Okay, so that global decline has happened by a massive 36%. So in that phase, if you take a look at Indian decline, it does not appear to be that very stark. But we cannot be happy with that okay, the world is performing worse than us, so we are in a good place. No. So that is what the finance minister has basically talked about, that various different issues, for example, infrastructural requirements. For example, when we talk about the labor availability, because availability of skilled labor is again a crunch. Then, for example, tax incentives, clearing mechanism, all of that needs to be spruced up. Now, one of the reasons which was cited for this decline, again, which is relevant for your exam, that is friendshoring. And by the way, here, do you need to remember the data? Ideally, in this case, there are not a lot of data pointers to be looked at, but a basic idea that the FDI has declined by more than 10% or double digits, and the global decline is almost 2.5 times of that. So almost 2 times of that. So that trend should be looked into. Even if the data is forgotten, ensure that you understand that trend, because it is that trend which you can be asked in the examination. You can get a statement type question that Indian or the decline in FDI in India has been much larger as compared to the world. So you need to be very careful to be able to catch out these particular mistakes. So here you have the aspect of friendshoring, and friendshoring has been cited as one of the reasons why there has been a decline in investment in India. Now here, what is friendshoring? So friendshoring is basically channelizing of investments in those areas or those particular countries which are your strategic allies. For example, let's suppose a company from United States. Now that wants to invest abroad. Now there it scouts for the various different nations and it finds out, let's suppose that UK or United Kingdom is an ally of US, or Japan is an ally of US, and they start investing only in those areas. So because of the Russian-Ukraine war, the global geopolitical scenario has got divided unlike ever before in the recent past. So that is why this friendshoring has happened, and India, ensuring and maintaining an impartial attitude, basically has suffered ever so slightly because of it. So this is friendshoring. That is investments in areas where the nations are allies. Okay? That is something you should be aware of. So that marks the end of the discussion for today. Now the couple of questions, the mains type of questions which can be relevant. Discuss the pros and cons of internationalizing the rupee as a global currency. So this is relevant for your GS paper 3, 10 mark, 150 words, not a long answer needs to be written. So again, in the introduction, you have to talk about what do you mean by internationalizing of rupee, and there the pros and cons both needs to be highlighted. What can be the pros? The cost of borrowing will be less, the trading activities will be much more, greater amount of investment, easier investment in general. So these are the various benefits in the economy. The cons should also be highlighted, that you will have the country being exposed to greater amount of economic shocks in case of, let's say, there is a greater amount of demand in the international market, and there we have also discussed about it yesterday about the dilemma which is associated with that. Then after that, not only those shocks but greater vulnerability to economic crises in general, inflation can be a cause of concern. All those factors you have to write. Now in the later portion of the answer, before the conclusion part, try to write it out that how overall the benefits they outweigh the cost. And that is why in the long run it is not something which can be done overnight. So that is why the government's initiative towards that internationalization should be carried on with a more fervor pace, and India should seek to internationalize the rupee if it wants to increase its strategic power across the global superpower table. So that is how you can conclude it with a positive outlook and again an optimistic scenario. Then what is the objective of the High Seas Treaty? Briefly mention the point of contention held by the developed nation against these treaty. So the objective, to preserve the high seas, to conserve the high seas, right? So here, first of all, in the introduction itself, you can talk about what do you mean by high seas. It is a 15 marker question, 250 words. So you can write the introduction in around 30 to 35 words. Write about what is that high sea. Or you can do it in an alternate manner. First of all, you can talk about what that high sea treaty is in the brief introduction, and then in the initial part of body you can write about that what is this high seas as per the UN clause. This is high seas. Very brief rough diagram needs to be drawn here, and rough diagram in the sense it can be as rough as this one, where you just designate this as the shoreline, then the territorial waters, contiguous zone, exclusive economic zone, and then the high seas. Now there, first of all, you need to write about IGC, intergovernmental committees or conferences, and then the various different mechanisms which have been finalized, the clearinghouse mechanism, etc. All of that, you write into that, and eventually the challenge is the contention. And in the conclusion, do talk about how it is very, very pertinent and relevant to maintain the biodiversity and the ecological balance of the high seas. Otherwise, the global environment will suffer as a consequence. So that is how you can write the answer for these. I do encourage you, do suggest you, to do write the answers, to practice the answers as much as possible, get it evaluated, and that will be the end of the session. Overall, after this, I would encourage you to go to our Telegram channel and take up the multiple choice question quiz to gauge your level of understanding for the topics discussed. That will be all from my side. If you like the video, please don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe. Until we meet again, take care of yourself. Goodbye. Thank you.